While action RPGs have seemingly grown more and more fast-paced over the years, Tower of Kalemonvo dares to bring us back to the game's very early days with a heavy inspiration from the first title in the Diablo series. This means slower-paced combat, limited resources, and plenty of dark, cramped dungeons to explore, all of which are packaged together into a surprisingly challenging experience. My name's Johnny Bueno, and let's take a look at Tower of Kalemonvo. For the story setup in Tower of Kalemonvo, you can find everything you need in the completely optional lore section located in the main menu. Starting a new game will simply take you into the character creation sequence, so if you want to know why exactly you're climbing the Tower of Kalemonvo, you need to click on the little lore book in the lower right corner. And I just have to say, I love the retro-inspired main menu with all of the different sections of the menu represented by different highlightable icons. I feel like this isn't something you see in many modern games and can add a lot of character to one of the very first parts of the game players will interact with. Anyway, what does our little lore book give us for a story introduction? The man himself, the wizard Kalemonvo, is apparently dead. The magic field protecting his tower has gone down, and all sorts of unsavory individuals have flooded in to plunder the tower's secrets. The real prize, however, is one of Kalemonvo's great orbs located at the very top of the tower. The local cult, known as the Cult of the Moon and the Sun, have great interest in Kalemonvo's big orb and are quickly making their way to the summit to claim it. This is where you come in. Your job is to stop the cult from claiming the orb in what essentially seems like a race to the top of the tower. Fortunately, you know of a super secret entrance to the tower leading into the lower dungeons, and this is where your journey begins. Resupply is impossible. Help is not coming. There is no turning back. You alone must brave through the Tower of Kalemonvo. And there you have it. We have our reason for entering the tower and why the tower itself is so important. I'm not entirely sure why this section is completely optional, as I feel story context is pretty important when starting a game. However, seeing as this is an ARPG, there are likely players out there that really don't care about the story and want to just dive in, kill monsters, and collect loot. But there are some NPCs you'll run into along the way that do give you some additional lore details or tell you the current affairs within the tower. So it's not like this optional introductory text is all you get for the entire game. And if you're really into story and want to learn about every facet of lore the game has to offer, there's also a bestiary section in the lore book where you can learn more about the gruesome enemies that lurk within the tower. Enough about the lore though, let's jump into the game. When clicking on the door in the center of the main menu to start a new game, you'll be presented the option of selecting one of two characters, a chiseled blonde Chad or an indifferent redhead. This choice obviously affects the in-game model of your character when exploring the tower, with no real customization options, just like classic Diablo. The blonde's default name is Athanasi and the redhead's default name is Kira, or you can of course pick your own name. I went with Johnny Bueno because I'm Johnny Bueno. You then get to pick your starting weapons, which I'll touch on more in a bit when we talk gameplay, and then it's time to begin our quest. Like I mentioned earlier, Tower of Kalemonvo leans heavily into its inspiration from classic Diablo, especially Diablo 1. You'll spend the entire game trapped in dark, claustrophobic dungeons with minimal lighting and a foreboding, horror-esque atmosphere. This feeling persists through the entire game as you never really leave the tower, unlike Diablo 1, where there's an actual starting town. So you could argue this game leans more into feeling oppressive with few points of reprieve in your journey. You also never know when opening a door could reveal a horde of enemies, which is a genuinely terrifying feeling and a hilarious jump scare. In many cases, death could just be one open door away, and I think that helps the game feel all the more intense. Each level of the tower is mostly randomly generated like a typical ARPG, with different floor layouts, enemies, and loot changing every time you start a new run. You'll essentially be running through a series of dungeons searching for the exit to the next floor, with the scenery changing from a typical dungeon to a more castle-like interior to a cave filled with nasty bugs and more. So it's not like you'll be seeing the same old gray brick interior with some bloody accents here and there for the entire game. One thing I did like is that once you find the exit, you can teleport directly back to it at any time. So you can continue to explore your current floor without having to worry about backtracking all the way to the exit. If you're used to combat in more modern ARPGs like Path of Exile or some of the more recent Diablo titles, combat in Tower of Kalemonvo is going to feel very, very slow. You will slowly walk through the game's dungeons with no real means of increasing your movement speed as far as I could tell, so progressing towards the exit will feel very gradual. On top of that, your attacks will often miss, especially at the start of the game, since there's a specific stat tied to the accuracy of your attacks. So not only are you moving slow, but you'll often be swinging at air most of the time as well, leading to a longer time to kill on enemies. Spells and abilities in general also don't affect a massive area, so you won't be wiping entire rooms of enemies with the click of a button. This may feel somewhat dull to the modern ARPG player, especially at the start of the game when you have low attributes, little gear, and no spells in your repertoire. But it does help the game's combat feel more grounded and intense, with enemy encounters requiring a bit more strategy and microplay, as you may often find yourself needing to kite enemies or trap them in a choke point. And that's not to say the entire game will stay as slow-paced as the first few floors, because it does pick up a bit once you've gained some levels and optimize your character's gear and build. Just don't expect to be blitzing through rooms and trampling over enemies like they're nothing. When it comes to taking out enemies, you're given a fairly wide variety of weaponry. At the start of the game, you're given the option of beginning your journey equipped with 2 of 4 weapon options, including a sword, bow, staff, and shield. These 4 options are just what you want to start with, and aren't indicative of all the weapon types available in the game, as you'll also come across spears, axes, staves, scythes, and many more. There are no classes in Tower of Kalemonvo, and abilities are tied to your weapon type, so these starting choices can maybe serve more as a basis of what you want to build your character around. While we're here, I'll also mention that there's a few more options for those seeking a greater challenge, like Despair mode, which reduces your HP and stat gains for each level. Or the classic Iron Man mode, which features permadeath and only allows you to save your game when exiting the game or returning to the main menu. Both are great options for players who have already completed the game and are looking for a more difficult experience on top of what is already a surprisingly difficult game. Yeah, I died many times, even on a normal playthrough, and learned how crucial it is to save often in this game. And there's a few reasons for this. First is that if you haven't found a better weapon than the one you're carrying, or if you haven't been upgrading your gear in general, enemies are going to quickly outclass you as you ascend floors. That weapon you found on the first floor won't be doing you many favors 2 or 3 floors later. So I found you need to adapt a bit and pick up weapons simply if they have a higher damage range, even if they don't fit your build. It can be frustrating if RNG isn't blessing you with the type of weapon you really want. I swear when I made my bow-focused character, I didn't see a single bow drop for several floors, and at that point it felt like I was shooting hot dogs at enemies instead of arrows. So try to upgrade as often as possible, and if you can't, adapt until you find that precious piece of loot you're looking for. The other thing that adds to the difficulty of Tower of Kalemonvo is the fact that obtaining healing and mana potions is entirely tied to RNG. There's no way to reliably purchase potions in this game, and you'll be praying that the next enemy or broken barrel will contain the life-saving health potion you need. In some spots, this did make the game feel nearly impossible to progress through, as there was a large group of enemies standing between me and the exit, and I had already exhausted my supply of potions. Yes, it does make the game feel more resource-limited and intense, but the feeling of being completely unable to progress at times can feel unfair. This didn't happen too often, but there were a few points in the game where I had to keep reloading my save in hopes that the next enemy would give me a health potion so I could finally progress. Fortunately, in the later stages of the game, this was less of an issue as I was killing enemies faster and taking less damage, giving me the opportunity to actually stockpile my potions. But those early and middle stages of the game got pretty rough. For abilities, you'll have access to combat arts, which, as I mentioned earlier, are tied to your weapon type. So for example, two-handed weapons will have their own set of combat arts called overwhelming arts, sword and shield will have balanced arts, and bows will have archery arts. These abilities are tied to your right click, and you can only have one slotted in at a time, which is admittedly kind of annoying, as I don't see any reason not to have a simple hotbar for your available combat arts. Instead, each combat art is given an assigned hotkey, and you'll need to press that key to slot it into your active ability slot, requiring a bit of memorization. Many of these combat arts aren't super complex, like the bow giving you variations of a slightly more powerful shot that either does some elemental damage, pierces enemies, or can ricochet around the room. Or multi-strike for one-handed weapons, which simply lets you perform 3 quick attacks in a row. This isn't to say that combat arts aren't useful, they're just not super exciting to use. My personal favorite, and maybe the only outlier here, was Hurl Weapon, which is only usable if you have a two-handed weapon equipped. It's exactly what it sounds like. You throw your weapon in a straight line and it comes back to you like a boomerang. It gave me a nice ranged option for my melee-focused character and was great for mowing down enemies who are nice enough to line up in single file. The only downside is if it encounters an obstacle when returning to you, your weapon will just drop to the floor and you'll need to pick it back up. If you don't have a weapon on backup, you'll be awkwardly left empty-handed, and this did in fact lead to my death a couple times. Spells in Tower of Kalemonvo work a little differently than combat arts, as these aren't tied to a weapon type like wands or staves. Spells are found in spellbooks found throughout the tower, which you need to pick up and right-click to learn, assuming you meet the intelligence requirement to learn it. I didn't experiment with spells or a more mage-focused build too much, but from what I saw, the game features enough spells to fit pretty much every situation. Projectiles, area spells, buffs, debuffs, traps, you name it. The variety of spellbooks I came across was pretty impressive, making mage build totally worth pursuing if that's your kind of thing. Lastly, for gameplay, and kind of a silly touch the devs added, was a dedicated taunt button bound to the D key for those who really want to talk smack to a bunch of computer-controlled enemies. Your character will deliver these goofy voice lines, and the blonde character specifically delivers his lines in the least threatening way possible. It honestly sounds more like a suggestion than a threat.
Prepare to meet your end. You don't frighten me. Who's next? You don't frighten me.
For progressing your character in Tower of Kalemonvo, you'll be slaying enemies and gaining experience to gradually level up your character. Every level, you're given 5 stat points to invest into a stat of your choosing, including strength, dexterity, agility, constitution, mind, and intelligence. If you've played pretty much any RPG ever, you probably already have an idea of how each of these stats works, but there are a few nuances in Tower of Kalemonvo worth covering. Dexterity, for example, is the stat tied to your attack rating, aka accuracy. As I mentioned earlier, your attacks will miss a lot if your attack rating is low, so some investment here may be worthwhile if you plan on doing any type of physical damage. Intelligence is crucial for mage builds, as it not only lets you learn more powerful spells, but also investing points into intelligence unlocks more spell slots on your spell wheel for every 5 points invested. The rest are pretty standard, with strength affecting your prowess with melee weapons, agility doing the same for ranged weapons, mind affecting your total mana, and constitution your total health. Combat arts also have specific stat requirements, like Hurl Weapon requiring 20 strength, or any of the bow arts requiring an investment into dexterity, so keep that in mind when allocating your stat points. Just choose wisely, as you can't change your point investments once they've been allocated. Stats included on gear are generally pretty basic compared to the laundry list of bonuses you would see in most modern ARPGs. In this game, you'll typically see bonuses to your core stats or some sort of added damage bonus for offense, or increased damage resistance to a specific damage type and increases to your armor or dodge values for defense. These are what I found on the vast majority of gear pieces, but there are some other bonuses like increased spellcasting speed, mana or health stolen on hit, or returning some damage to the attacker. But again, nothing super in-depth, and maybe something that leans a little too far into the classic appeal at its own detriment. But that's entirely up to the player, as some people might prefer the simpler approach to gearing, especially compared to the rest of the genre. There are unique items that drop from some boss enemies that carry more unique effects not found on other gear though, like this scimitar that has a stacking damage effect that resets on miss, promoting a build more focused on building attack rating and accuracy. So there is at least some potential for more diverse gearing and build variety out there, you just need to know where to look. However, there's not much you can do with all the useless or old gear that you collect or upgrade out of. The few vendors in the game can't be sold to and only let you purchase items using silver skulls, an item you pick up through pure RNG that serves as the game's sole form of currency. I found out it was actually intended by the developer to be this way in an effort to keep parts of the game simple and to avoid what they describe as busy work. I'll admit it didn't feel great to just drop my old gear and leave it behind, but I understand the desire to keep things simple, especially if the game is aiming for a truly retro experience.
That won't fit.
Tower of Kalemonvo is the perfect love letter to classic Diablo. Combat is slow-paced and intense, and the atmosphere expertly captures the dark, claustrophobic feeling from Diablo 1. While the simple gearing and progression may be a negative for some, it might be exactly what others are into, especially if you're looking for an ARPG inspired by one of the granddaddies of the genre. That's all for now though, so if you enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a like or sharing your thoughts on Tower of Kalemonvo in the comments below. I appreciate every bit of interaction and support, as I love making videos just like this one. So please consider subscribing to support the channel, and as always, thank you for watching.